Hi, I'm Jennifer Campbell, creator and host of the Systemic Leadership Summit. Welcome to this session. When we look at today's session, then we can say that complexity science has come a long way in helping us understand the inner dynamics that shape systemic patterns. Yet such insights have proven hard to really translate into effective forms of action. Hence the question repeatedly asked by the decision makers out there in the world or in our organizations is, how can we bridge the gap between complexity thinking and complexity doing? Today, we'll discuss this question and many other, hopefully thought-provoking questions by exploring a project called Social Acuppuncture. We will discuss its meaning as well as its application through design thinking, together with my guest for today. She is the creator of the Social Acupuncture Project, and her name is Orit Gal. Currently, Orit is a senior lecturer for strategy and complexity at Regent's University, London. She is a political economist with a deep curiosity for the inner workings of complex social systems. Orit is also the founder of Urbanizer, a London-based tech startup. More about that later. An expert generalist, she has worked in tech startups, corporate market research, peace-building NGOs, and innovative policy and military think tanks. Having the opportunity to closely observe decision makers operating in messy, volatile, and highly complex environments, she set on a passionate search for new knowledge that could help design more effective action. Social acupuncture brings the fruits of this research to light, and today we have an opportunity to learn more about it from Orit herself. So very warm welcome to you, Orit. Thank you so much for being here with us in the Systemic Leadership Summit.
Thank you so much for having me. This is fascinating. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, me too. And before we dive into social acupuncture as a culture, as a project, as a research, as something that is really tied to you and what you find important in your work when it comes to complexity, is that I like to look at what the difference is between what we call the systemic and the complex. Because in my intro, I used complexity, and that's what you use in terms of complexity thinking and complexity doing or action. But we seem to be using the systemic and the complex like interchangeably, but they're not the same. So what, in your opinion, is the difference?
Well, the way I see it, complexity and complexity science is really the theoretical side of understanding how reality unfolds. So think about it like the laws of nature.
Mm-hmm.
We get so much more insight now into understanding really how dynamics unfold. And in terms of systemic, for me, that takes it to the realm of praxis. This is all about intention. We create systemic models of reality around us so we can understand it better and we can impact it better. But the only way to create those models is by basing our knowledge on our deep understanding of how reality unfolds, which is in the realm of complexity.
Mm-hmm. So one is to help understand, and the other is to then create. Do I get that right?
To create, yes, and to intentionally understand specific context. So complexity will give us the overall understanding of what happens. Sorry, that's my dog.
Yeah.
But it won't
Do you need to
give
go
us,
and take care of him for a second?
that's fine, she'll go away in a second. And hence, emergent phenomena. But generally, systemic is all about the intention of how we operate in the world that has been created by these kind of laws of nature, which are all based on complexity understanding of how systems operate.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I find it so interesting that, and actually, I want to take a quote from your website when we look at this seeming contrast between theory and trying to understand and practice and trying to create is, and I quote, where you say, whether running a country, a city, or a business, or a social campaign, the greatest challenges standing in our way are always complex, involving numerous players and constrained by multiple interdependent forces, and they form systemic patterns that are seemingly impossible to break. Now, tackling them requires creative new approaches that not only address their complex nature, but are uniquely designed to take advantage of them. And we're going to be talking about the complex, but we also want to look at what are the systemic creations that we have out there at the moment, the patterns that we have, so that we can use what we know from complexity to then address them. So, what are some of the systemic patterns that you see out there that are really coming to the surface of, let's say, the here and now of our daily life?
Well, I think that any phenomena that you identify within your proximity, within politics, within culture, within cities is always complex, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's always emerges out of many, many people behaving in certain ways, taking certain actions. And what we end up with are these dominant patterns. So think about what makes a great urban vibe. Why do you like cities? Why do you like to hang out in a specific place? It's not because
Mm-hmm.
somebody can engineer it. It's because it brings together multiple people and experiences and businesses and design and lots of other things that together create a pattern that self-sustains itself. So people want to hang out there, and because people want to hang out there, you have this really great vibe and more people want to come. At the
Yeah.
same time, when you look at conflict, it's really the same thing. So you could look at positive phenomena and negative phenomena and actually see how the processes of emergence are really the same. It's all about people behaving in certain ways, and whatever they do recreates a certain pattern.
Yeah. 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 So it could be anything. So you already mentioned a couple of examples, like what we see in the bigger realms like politics or economy, but also in the day-to-day living and the interactions. And indeed, if you have a place that feels really nice where you live or where you work, then there is a multitude of factors and people and processes in place that co-create whatever it is that you're experiencing at that point. And so, um, what would you say then? How all these patterns, how they are interacting in, for example, a business context? What does this look like?
Well, if you look at business, or if you look at business culture, for example, what happens within your own organization,
Mm-hmm.
again, there will be certain patterns of behavior that seem to dominate the environment, and they will incentivize certain behaviors and constrain other behaviors from actually occurring. And of course, because this is a spontaneous emergence, if it's great, then wonderful. If it's problematic, of course, it is much harder to shift because there are so many people involved.
Yeah.
So that is really the kind of wonderful and the frustrating about complex dynamics.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, what happened for you is that you were looking at all these systemic patterns and you were looking at the complexity and wondering about the doing. So, could you share more about what exactly social acupuncture then is and how that emerged for you?
So I think that for me, it always emerged from the doing, the challenges and diving into complexity theories themselves came out of a need to do and a need to impact really complex environments, and trying to find, new tools to actually do that. And once you actually learn more about complexity and dive into, this weird and wonderful world, you actually come to the conclusion that if reality is complex, it's always been complex, right? This is not something new.
No.
So I was trying to explore, is there any interesting references out there of people, places, times where there was a deep understanding of reality as a complex system? And if that was the case, what was the toolbox that they used?
Okay.
And that kind of brought me to ancient Chinese strategic thought, and from there on to Chinese medicine. And when you think about medicinal art is always about problem solving, right? That's the whole point of medicine, to solve problems.
Yeah.
So it kind of made sense as a really interesting metaphor to start exploring what did that mean for the people who were developing those tools, and what can we learn from that to implement in a completely different time and space and types of problems.
Yeah. And so what I'm noticing is that you are referring to actually ancient times, to history, where after realizing, well, complexity has always been, it's not something new. And what I find interesting is that sometimes we look back into history and wonder how people dealt with some really complex situations, or questions like, how did people build these gigantic pyramids, for example, because they didn't have the tools and technology that we have now. So there is some sort of an innate ability that we have as human beings to deal with complexity. And if I understand you correctly, you are looking for the toolbox. You're looking for, what are the ways that in the different disciplines we have tried to deal with complexity, and how can we translate that into our current life and the patterns that we are dealing with now. And so if we try to translate that then to, for example, your work with leaders, you teach strategy and complexity. You work with them. You work in all kinds of different contexts where leaders need to deal with complex situations and make strategic decisions. And so, how do you help them see the patterns? How do you help them see the way you look at what happened before, how we dealt with complexity before, so that they are also able to do that?
Wow, that's a big question. But if I were to kind of break it down, it's about helping them build models of reality around them in a way that they could utilize as a learning tool. And what do I mean by that? The whole point of understanding and seeing the world through complexity is the fact that you can't engineer it, right? You can't create an ideal model and then backwards engineer whatever you want to create around you.
Yeah.
It means you need to operate in this very adaptive form where you're trying to make sense of reality, or trying to impact that. You do something. You need to understand what impact you actually had, and then you need to recalibrate both what you think about the reality itself and what you actually need to do with that.
Yeah.
Now, in order to create these models, you basically need to do things. One, you need to understand the actual trends. So to really understand what is the problem, whether it's about new markets or new technologies or new public policy, or whether it is, about anything more specific that is happening on the ground. What is happening in China, whatever it is. So you need an understanding of the actual dynamics and the specific players and the relationship between them. So you need to map out the network
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, you need to understand what I call propensities. Now, propensities are these kind of laws of nature driven from complexity theory that helps us understand not what happens, that is in the specific context, but how things happen. So
Right.
you give a leader an understanding of both how to frame all the information that he or she has gathered about the context
Mm-hmm.
together with strong tools to predict how things will unfold, then they would have a much better chance at identifying potential and leverage and designing better strategies, basically.
Right, right. And so, to what extent, and I did hear you say the word trend, to what extent do you also help leaders to detect um, a future as it's coming towards them? Because trends is one thing. And I also heard you say, like, predict what will happen. Um, but to what extent is there the creating and going towards the future with your organization and with your strategy? And to what extent is it pulling in the here and now what you see coming towards you and your organization as it's unfolding? I hope it makes sense what I'm saying, because one has to
Yeah.
do with intentional, where you want to take your organization, and one has to do with working with whatever future is emerging. And I want to know what your view is on that.
So when I say predicting, it's not predicting what will happen, but you have much better insight into how things will happen.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of preparing yourself for the future, this is exactly where the trends analysis come. And for me, it's more about identifying tensions between trends. So
Right.
if you think about any situation, it's always multidimensional. There will be economic elements, technological elements to it, political and cultural. Always you will have all of these dimensions. And there will be different shifts and different trends in all of these different dimensions. And then the question is, how do they relate? Where do they converge, or where do they diverge, or where do you see conflicts emerging between emerging trends?
Mm-hmm.
And once you identify the systemic tensions that are growing within the system, you can better prepare yourself either to take advantage of it
Yeah.
or to make sure to shelter yourself from whatever
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I
And
think it is a constant. So when an organization looks towards the future and thinks about its own strategy, it is always with a thought of both identifying potential and leverage, how to better position yourself and take advantage of things that are coming your way,
mm-hmm.
and also to have a better understanding of where your whole ecology is shifting to.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and when you say your whole ecology, that means that you have profound awareness of your organization's context and environment, and how all the other elements or other players or other organizations, or how the industry is moving in the bigger realm, so that you can yeah, do this exercise of seeing the interconnectedness and seeing the patterns along which things are unfolding. And so,
Absolutely. And I would add just to that, that it's not necessarily that there is a boundary between the organization and the environment. Many times, from a leader's perspective, part of what you're going to be analyzing is how it impacts different elements within your own organization.
yeah,
So, you think about cultural trends or technological trends. Um, the boundary between the organization and the environment doesn't necessarily exist. From your own analysis, if you're trying to create change, you might try to take advantage of things that are happening out there to actually impact and shift how the organization works from the inside, or vice versa.
mm-hmm,
So that is also really important, that you analyze the system from the perspective of the decision maker, And from the perspective of the decision maker, that system encompasses both internal organizational elements and external.
Right, right. And so let's see if we can discuss an example of an organization. Maybe there's one you want to share with one of the leaders you worked with, or a particular organization you worked with, to see what that actually looks like. So do you have an example to share with us, like certain rules of thumb that decision makers can make to really navigate all this complexity?
Well, I don't think that rules of thumb exist as such. And it's hard to discuss a specific example without giving too much information about the actual context. But I think that generally, when you think about the dynamics, again, it's really, really important to, first of all, as a rule of thumb, look at the system from the perspective of the decision maker. So you're not zooming out. It's not looking at your organization as a petri dish. And within your specific angle, it's all about what are the flows of resources and information from your own perspective into the system. So who are the people working around you? What are the power structures within the organization? What is restricting adaptability and change within the organization? And again, the boundaries between internal and external are dependent on the context. But it's really looking at it from the perspective of the decision maker. What exactly is keeping you up at night? I think that is the first question. What exactly are the challenges that you see? It's not about analyzing a system in some subjective form. It's really about, specifically from a decision maker's perspective, what is their mandate, what are they trying to achieve, and what is standing in their way. Because the first point of strategy is, first of all, to identify what is standing in your way. And then it's about identifying potential for changing that around. And that doesn't matter if this is a university or a classroom or a multinational corporation, a big one, or just a startup. It will always repeat itself. From your own perspective, what does the system look like? What are you trying to achieve, and what are the challenges?
Yeah. I find this so interesting that the decision maker's perspective is very important in the approach as you are unfolding and explaining it, because the decision maker's perspective is one perspective and one sort of subsystem in the multiple systems that could be looking at and contributing to the ultimate decision about what are our strategic choices and possibilities. So why so much focus on the viewpoint of the decision maker in that sense? And I'm asking you just to put this in a little bit more context. It reminds me of a conversation I also had for the Systemic Leadership Summit in one of our previous editions, where we were saying that, for example, systemic leadership and learning is not just about the learner and the one who wants to teach, but it's also about the system of that needs to be learned, or the context or the classroom in which things are learned. So there are so many different elements that contribute to the learning process. And to me, it seems like there's a parallel type of thing going on in a strategic decision-making process, that it's not just the context and the decision maker, but also all the other viewpoints. So to make a long story short, why so much emphasis on the decision maker's view?
So when I say the decision maker's view, I think that's the starting point. That's the angle into the system. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously the system itself encompasses loads of other elements, people, dynamics, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
But the key and the emphasis I'm giving to the decision maker, because reality is driven by action.
Yeah.
And any system that you want to change, it is about changing actions.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a very big difference in terms of bringing you into an organization in terms of who is actually driving the change and who has the intention
Mm-hmm.
and willingness to start creating a certain change. And this is why it is so important to think about the decision maker you're working with, because he or she has the mandate to do that.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I think that a common mistake that I find is taking a very kind of academic view of looking at a problem from this very objective, bird's eye view, and I'm going to do amazing mapping of all the problem from all perspectives, but it stays as an academic exercise.
Yeah.
No one operates at the systemic level. We use the systemic level to understand challenges and to identify opportunities and leverages, but no one operates there. Reality
Mm.
is driven by action, and action is taken within systems. So
Yeah.
I'm using the perspective of the decision maker who has brought me in to expand their horizon and their learning process and their awareness into all the dynamics that are unfolding within their environment. So that
Right.
is kind of focus.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, that makes sense. So, and I love that distinction that you make. So we use the systemic level to understand, but once we go and take action, then it happens in the system or systems, and that is then taken by the decision maker who has a mandate to make the changes. So that definitely makes sense. And at some point, um, there's a decision to start a change. And so the change usually starts by disrupting the running patterns
Mm-hmm.
before building something new, or by breaking the patterns, creating something new.
Exactly.
So where do you start? Because it's a distortion of the status quo, so to speak. Um, from the complexity doing perspective, how do you introduce something disruptive or something that breaks the pattern?
So again, we need to remember that patterns are recreated on a daily basis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Patterns are not just created once and are fixed structure in our environment.
Yeah.
They're recreated every day by what everyone does. So think, for example, of a corrupt system. A corrupt system only exists because people exchange favors outside of the legitimate system on a
Yeah.
daily basis.
Yeah.
If tomorrow morning there won't be such an exchange, the system wouldn't be corrupt, right?
Yeah.
So the leverage here is the fact that it is being recreated every day, and therefore you can impact behaviors every day that will gradually nudge the system. And I
Mm-hmm.
think what you said right now is really, really important, because the only thing you can actually do as an intervention in a complex system is really disrupt or enhance certain dynamics. You cannot
Mm-hmm.
create willingly something new. It is all about subverting existing dominant patterns, seeing what is emerging as an alternative, and trying to strengthen whatever you want to focus on. And this is exactly where systemic analysis comes to the fore. You identify what are the flows, for example, of resources or information across the network. And you
Mm-hmm.
identify points where you could experiment with small interventions
Mm-hmm.
that will have an accumulated impact. And you intervene usually in multiple places, and you see what happens, you iterate, you adapt, and you act again. There is never a silver bullet or one place where you would concentrate all your efforts on. It's all about this gradual disruption of existing behaviors. And over time, you will reach a critical mass where the behaviors start to create different patterns, or are now not recreating the dominant patterns that we've seen before, at least subverting them. So it might be about giving certain people in the network more power to make certain decisions on the ground. It might be about just giving people new information into the flow that they didn't have before. It might even just be about something as simple as measuring something new in the system, because people always react to what you measure. And giving that information out. So there's so many different ways to play with it, but it's always about understanding what people do. And it's always important to remember that, most people are not stupid and are not evil. So there is a logic to why they behave the way they do.
Yeah.
And once we dig into what is happening within their local proximity, in their networks, we can understand what drives that behavior and how to disrupt it.
And so what I find really interesting is that you say it's all you can do is to disrupt the patterns that exist. And you can try and do so by doing this in different places, and then evaluate, reiterate, and then go at it again, so to speak. And so this sounds like the way you view it, that it's not possible to do a bigger disruption. And I'm asking because in a number of conversations in this summit, we're talking about the word transformation. And usually, especially also in the all this technological development that's going on, and there's digital transformation here and there, and everyone has this idea that there's a total overhaul and a total turnaround of organizations. But does that mean that interruption is thought of to be much bigger and more disruptive than it actually is, or can be introduced? Or is that just a different view on what's possible in terms of change for you?
So I think it's both. First of all, just because you disrupt local patterns doesn't mean that you don't fundamentally transform the system as a whole. So the effect is non-linear. You could have very small shifts with huge consequences.
Yeah.
So that is really important to remember, that it's not the intuitive equation of big actions with big outcomes. That's not how it works. And the other thing, I think that also there is a huge overshooting and overemphasis on transformations, which are not as big as they are made out to be. So, think about what has been going on with cryptocurrencies over the last few years. Some of it is really fundamental innovation that is really going to transform our lives. And some of it is just, another way to think about tokens, or another way to think about coupons or monopoly money or whatever it is. Just like data analytics, most of it is very similar to the kind of statistical analysis that, we would have done 20, 30 years ago. So there's always hype.
Yeah.
And it's always interesting to distinguish and say, okay, so what is really new here? And that will always, whatever is really transformational is always a lock-in mechanism between multiple dimensions. So when you have shifts that are both political and technological and economic and cultural that somehow converge together, they will have a really amplified impact. So think about social media, think about fake news, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing this example and your thoughts on this, because so what I take from this is that you can make small changes that have big consequences, and there's always also this element of hype that sort of invites you to think of a big change, but it actually really isn't. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's what I take from that is that it's very important to understand what the consequences are of the pattern disruption that you do, and to look at changes in the bigger context and see whether these are really pattern interruptions or whether they are just more of the same,
Yeah,
but have a different color or a different flavor, but
exactly.
are actually not a change to the patterns.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that really makes sense. And um, what I find fascinating also, we're speaking about making strategic change and looking at patterns and what decision makers can do to go to complexity doing. And within a context of change, what I find so fascinating is I read some of your work where you say that actually every change agent also finds itself in like a rival system. There are many other change makers out there who may be looking at the same or similar patterns, but may have different places where they want to do pattern disruption, or they have different potential solutions that they want to introduce. Could you speak more to that about the rival system for change agents and how that and the value of looking at it that way for decision makers?
So I think this is really important because when you try to take on systemic problems, again, you need to understand that there's a logic for why they emerge to begin with. They make sense. So again, a corrupt system, a criminal network works because there are certain conditions that allow it to work, and the patterns that dominate it are there because they naturally emerge. And therefore, if you're trying to change it, inevitably you are trying to change behaviors and you're trying to change incentive structures. So for any dominant pattern, whether it's we would value it as a good one or a bad one,
Mm-hmm.
um, there are certain incentive structures that come with it.
Yeah.
Resources, information, status, whatever it is. So whenever you're trying to change a system, inevitably you're going to get, conflictual energies within that.
Yeah.
It's not that nobody has thought to solve, a conflict before. So you're not coming with a new idea.
Mm-hmm.
There is a reason why the conflict persists.
Yeah.
You need to understand that those patterns that are sustaining it as your rival system. This is your rival system. And of course, if this is your rival system, there will be a lot of players that either are enjoying some of the fruits of that pattern. And
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that they intentionally created those structures. But once the structures are there, they will lose out if those dynamics shift.
Yeah.
So you have the system itself that you're trying to change as your rival system, and you have specific players that will lose out from the change. And
Yeah.
again, you could see that at a global level or at an organizational level. We all know how, organizational politics work.
Yeah.
And of course, the other element is when you identify trends that can allow or help change to be enacted within the system, there will be other players out there who will always identify it as well, but they want to push the system in a different way. So
Yeah.
again, think about social media, which was supposed to be, we all talked about it 10, 15 years ago, this amazing democratization tool that will bring enlightenment to all, and we see how players play it in different ways, right? So we can't be naive about it. System change is not just about bringing all the stakeholders together into one room and having this kumbaya moment.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's an operation that requires a lot of effort and a lot of maneuvering to get the kind of outcome that you really want to get.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
then you're disrupting a dominant pattern, right? You cannot create the ultimate ideal reality that you want. And once the dominant pattern untangles itself, it creates multiple opportunities. So then
Yeah.
the question is, who wins out of that disruption?
Yeah. 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 For some reason, what a number of things pop up for me, and the word the word rival system also reminds me almost of the survival of the fittest, like what we see in nature. Like if there's an imbalance in nature, then um, uh, automatically others who profit from the imbalance um, appear, or something happens to find a new sort of balance. And here I actually hear the same. So there are how I hear what you're trying to say is there's an understanding that if there's a system that needs that you want to change or influence, and you bring a certain change or distortion or um, an interruption of the pattern, that the pattern is there for a reason, and it always has side effects or main effects to your own organization, to yourself, or to others that allow for it to remain as is. And so you're competing against the payoff that certain people got from really keeping the pattern in place. The other aspect is that there are multiple change agents who also see the pattern, also want to disrupt it, but in a different way. And so it's that network of um, disruptions that are at play that make it so that you can't really 100% interrupt a pattern into a new reality that is exactly the way you want it, or exactly the way you need it to be for your organization. But if I get you correctly, having that awareness and having that understanding, and also looking at the rivals, so to speak, in that rival system, is that it's probably maybe not easier, but you can be more intentional or more clear about the pattern interrupting that you're doing yourself. Is that what you were trying to say?
Yes, because it's very easy to think about change without thinking about the opposition and how the opposition will unfold.
Mm-hmm.
And again, think about something as obvious as increasing social mobility.
Yeah.
You want to increase social mobility, but what does that really mean? It means that if you now have a lack of social mobility, you have a lot of people, say, closer to the top, who have an easier time retaining their position. But if you're going to increase social mobility, it means that not only will more people move up, it also means that people are going to move down,
Yeah.
right? That's what mobility is. So what does that look like? How does that unfold? What can you create to put people more at ease in terms of the shifts that you want to create?
Yeah.
So always think about the opposition, not just of the obvious who is enjoying the fruits of the current dominant patterns. And again, it's not that they intentionally created it, it's just that once it emerged, it worked in their favor. But also the unintended consequences, because another strategic mistake that seems to repeat itself is that leaders don't see a lot of players that are seemingly irrelevant to the problem that they identify in the beginning, because they seem to be out there or completely neutral. But again, once you start to change the system, their position also changes, and suddenly they do have vested interest that they didn't have before.
Mm-hmm.
So again, being able to identify that and really looking at the ecology as a whole allows you to, again, not predict, but better foresee potential opposition or collaborations in that sense.
Right. Okay, so we've been talking about various things. We've been talking about when we look at complexity thinking and looking at systemic patterns, for leaders to have an understanding of how can I look at the current situation? How can I look at the interplay of what's going on in the system, in the system's context, in the larger ecology of my organization? Where do I want to take my organization and why? If I want to influence and break patterns, then what does a rival system look like? And so complexity theory is something that we can also use to apply to that type of strategic thinking and approach, and where we can look for trends, which are also patterns and possibilities for your organization. And so once we've done all that, then at some point we get to the complexity doing. And from my understanding is that in your research, you were looking, you discovered the gap between the thinking and complexity thinking and complexity doing. And what were your first findings in closing that gap? In other words, after all that strategizing, what are we actually taking into action?
So first of all, it is about small experimentations, because from your initial analysis, you basically create a world of assumptions, right, about what is happening within a certain space. But then you need to test it out. So the first element is to take little actions to test out your initial assumptions about the situation. And then the main element is to understand that there is no process whereby you analyze a problem, you come up with a solution, and you implement that solution. It doesn't work that way. This is an engineering process that doesn't work in complex environments.
Right. So that's the linear approach again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In a complex environment, you analyze the system, you design solution, you implement it, and you constantly go back and test your own assumptions. And you constantly adapt, because you've done something to the system, you wait a bit for the dust to settle, and you figure it out again. And some of it might relate because you have actually created an impact in the system, you've changed it, and now you need to think about your next move. And some of it is actually to figure out that some of your assumptions might have been completely wrong.
Yeah.
The point of action is actually to reveal new information for you, rather than just to create impact. It is both to impact and to reveal new information.
Right.
And I think this is the key of the design process. It is an ongoing exploration whereby you need to feel very comfortable in recalibrating your initial thoughts and your understanding of what the hell is going on. So you need to put yourself in a place that is really comfortable with saying, actually, I got that completely wrong. And really learn to enjoy this exploration process. Otherwise, it's hell.
Yeah. Because what I actually hear you say is, whereas in the engineering sense, we go from point A, we have our solution to get to point B, and then, to put it really bluntly, that's it. But with a complex situation, you can't do that. And so there are a lot of reiterations and adjustments that you need to make. And like questioning your own assumptions or changing your own assumptions and admitting that the assumptions were not working, or some of them were not working, or you need to replace some of them and then go at it again based on the information that you get, it can be very disruptive for yourself. So I'm also wondering, what does it take for a decision maker to actually step into that? Because you just said, if you don't, it's not going to be a very pleasant and not very energizing type of process. And most of all, your organization will not be able to benefit from you as decision makers going through this process. So what do you need to step into, or who do you need to be in order to do such a process?
So first of all, it takes us back to the question you asked me previously, which is why look at it from the decision maker's perspective.
Yeah.
If we're now operating in this non-engineering linear fashion where you'll have a strategic team with the decision maker, they'll design the strategy and then give it to somebody else in the organization to implement, and let's meet together in 6 months, that's not going to work.
No.
So the whole understanding of the problem, of the impact of the dynamics, not only needs to be done from the decision maker's perspective, but there's a much more involved role for the decision maker herself in actually managing and leading that process of exploration.
Yeah.
So they need to be really hands-on in this. So building a small team within the organization that is going to work closely with the leader to implement that strategy and explore it. And then it is really about being comfortable and explaining that the strategy itself is an experiment.
Yeah.
There is a clear process of identifying the trajectory of where do we want to go, not where we want to get to. You cannot design or identify your end state, but what is the direction of travel. So once the decision maker has identified the direction of travel, then within the scope of that, exactly what happens, on that adventure, you could create the right culture that will feel very comfortable in, having a bumpy ride. And part of it is not just the frustration of getting your assumptions wrong, but part of it is also learning to really enjoy the great surprises along the way. So there's something to be said about positive surprises, of things that suddenly, you have created a great impact, or suddenly a whole realm of constraints were, just diminished because you did this small intervention on the sideways that had this wonderful knock-on effect. So there's a lot of good energies that emerge through that process, not just frustrations.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, it to me, it sounds like it can be compared to going on a trip and knowing where you end up, or going on a journey where you're going to be exploring what the road looks like and what you'll discover along the way, and you do not have like a very specific end destination, because that's not really possible. And so this requires that you have people around you who want to go on that journey and actually enjoy the ups and downs of the exploration around that. And because otherwise there's going to be so much emphasis on not having like a specific end result, and that can be very frustrating and very yeah, actually I think that would lead to a lot of loss of energy in terms of what you'd be able to discover, as opposed to when you really enjoy the journey. And so, what I'd like to ask you, if you could share one of your own journeys, because I know that with your tech startup that you founded, Urbanizer, that you also went through this process yourself, where actually the social acupuncture, as you described it in your project, was shaped through your own, let me say, systemic design of a solution. So could you share with us what that looked like, and how what we just discussed, how that shaped and turned out for you?
So I think that the main thing when you design anything, it is about, again, going into the local level and understanding why people behave in a certain way and what do they really need. So many times, you get really excited about a solution or a technology or something like that, and you focus on that and then convincing people to do it. Because of all of the years that, I've had in analyzing ecologies, it's really about the fascination of sitting with people and seeing how they behave. So how do they move through cities? How do they memorize places? And really analyzing behaviors and seeing how these behaviors create both patterns and problems that they really want to have solved. What are the actual human needs from everyday life?
Yeah.
And I think that using that perspective, I think, allowed me to better define what is a problem to be solved than other cases of similar tools or similar nature. So really focusing on, so what really is the problem and how do you define it? And going back through an iterative process to see, in this case, I was focusing on how people organize and plan their daily lives within cities and how they remember places. So rather than focusing on discovery, for example, of how do I recommend places to people, a lot of exploration, seeing that they don't have a problem with discovery. There are multiple places for discovery. They really have a problem with editing and organization, and therefore the angle is completely sideways. And actually working with people to design, the actual solutions. I think that is also really, really important. And going back to systemic thinking, I think, and what I said previously, that no one operates at the systemic level, everything we see emerging systemically is, again, an accumulation of everything, what everyone does at the local level.
Yeah.
So you need to constantly move between what you see is the overall kind of systemic level patterns, the macro, and then the micro, what do people actually do? And I think that you learn to really enjoy not big data, but small data. And really learn to enjoy, to understand, so why are people behaving in a certain way? Why do they take certain actions and not others? And I think that for any change you want to do in any organizations, once you understand that on a deep level, then the kind of structure, solutions, products, services that you will design will be much more effective.
Yeah. 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 And so thank you for that, for taking us with you in what you looked at and describing the process with this example. And so once you follow the process from looking at the macro and the micro and see how people really behave and what they really need, and then at some point, after so many iterations, you have your solution and you're ready to introduce that. And so creating something that is much more suitable for what people actually need is one process. But then there is the introduction process of that also. Now, it would make sense to say, if you've created something from real day-to-day behavior and what people really need, then it shouldn't be so difficult to introduce a product or a service or your solution out there in the world. But there are so many, again, competing solutions and change agents out there. So what can you say about introducing then a solution that comes so much more closer to what people actually need? How do you do that then?
So I think that's really important on two levels. First of all, understanding the competition. So for example, if I've designed this new travel planner, I might have competition in terms of other travel planners, but actually that's not my real competition. My real competition is the status quo and what people actually do, because they might use a notebook, because they might open an Excel sheet. So rather than looking at competition as the obvious other ventures, businesses out there that are seemingly solving the same problem, again, look at what people are actually doing. So that is, in terms of competitive analysis, is really important, because there's never a clean slate. There's no such thing as a new market. If there is a need, people have found just a different way to address it. It might not be as effective as what you thought, but it's out there. And the other elements that allows you to be really, really innovative in terms of how you introduce it is, again, I have tried to use social acupuncture for that as well, in terms of understanding where are the places that you can intervene to create the most impact. So if you understand that people tend to share information about places in certain group dynamics, then why not try to insert yourself into those dynamics rather than trying to advertise to everyone to change their behavior in a certain way. So again, really going into the micro and seeing through small local interactions where are the best places to intervene and place yourself to have the most impact, whether it is about greatest adoption of your new tool or having, you know, the greatest impact in terms of people talking about your tool. So really finding second, third order kind of interventions rather than the obvious that will be usually easier and cheaper to go into those specific spots, because it's not, you know, where everyone concentrates, and over time it will have a greater impact.
Yeah. So just to sum that up, there's two things. Have an understanding of who your real competition is, and also put yourself in those places, in those contexts where the introduction of your solution has either the biggest impact or is more readily received, because there's already for example, an intersection or already a movement going on, or already an inclination to what you're trying to accomplish with the solution that you have.
Absolutely. If I could add to that, I think the key is how you analyze organic networks. And I think that that is right, whatever product or service you're working on.
Yeah.
So network analysis in terms of how people actually share information, actions, resources, and behaviors. If you could analyze that in your relevant network, and you can always do that, this is where you'll find the greatest insights.
Yeah. Sounds to me like systemic marketing almost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Orit, we've almost come to the end of our conversation, and what I like to ask you is, you started the social acupuncture research project because you detected a gap between complexity thinking and complexity doing, and you also, for example, in your own company, went through that process to have experiences of your own, and so that you can work with that. And I'm just really curious, where did social acupuncture take you when it comes to complexity doing? Did you close the gap, or do you feel like there's more for you to unpack?
I think it's a journey. I think that once you start working, thinking, and acting from a systemic complexity perspective, I know we're still using that interchangeably here.
Yeah.
It's a bit, you know, like taking the red pill. It's, you know, you do that with your family, with your kids, with your business, wherever it is. You just see the environment around you in a different way. That said, I think I'm still on a learning journey in terms of how do you hone in and actually creating better and better impact. And yeah, I don't see an end to that learning process anytime soon.
Yeah. So I guess that what I hear you say is that once you enter this field of social acupuncture and start closing the gap and really go into the complexity doing, that that's a learning process, and that's a journey that's probably something you invite decision makers also to go on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a fun ride.
It's a fun ride. I think that makes all the difference. All right. We have been talking about your research, about complexity, thinking and doing, about looking at patterns, and looking at what it actually takes to break patterns and to try and be a change agent and introduce new things along a very strategic but also very systemic process of thoroughly understanding your organization, its environment, the ecological systems around them, and to see trends and how to see how things unfold rather than what unfolds.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not so much about predicting what's next, but it's more about um, understanding the unfolding as a pattern and more focus on the how.
And when you know the how, sorry, but when you know the how, you can also better predict the what. So they're
Okay.
very well connected.
So first, for those who are focused on the what or have the tendency to focus on the what, there's also some of that in there and not just the how.
Absolutely.
So thanks for adding that. We've come to the end, and I would like to say thank you so much for being in conversation with me about this really fascinating topic. And I'm sure that there's many new terms in there also for people to explore, but especially for those who are decision makers or who want to understand more about being a change agent in complex systems and settings, that this was a very fruitful conversation to watch. So thank you so much, Orit, for being on.
Thank you so much for having me.
And to everyone who's been watching, if you'd like to share your learning, your thoughts, or ideas around social acupuncture, design thinking, and complexity doing, then please go to our online community space. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.